Yeah, so we're normal now.
Okay.
Despite that funny incident. Can you believe that, though? Like, seriously.
I would be mortified.
Mortified. Well, whenever I do a conference in my office, I have to turn the self-view camera on because we'll forget, and I'll be like, just,
Yeah. Yeah, me
You
too.
know.
Where you're clearly like in space, you're like,
Yeah, usually, yeah. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
They see you on your phone.
Yeah, your nose or drinking really.
Yeah.
So, you know what I mean? So, anyway, okay, here we go. Hey, good morning, good afternoon, and maybe even for some of you, good evening. I am Elisa Fink, Chief Marketing Officer at Tableau. I am so delighted to welcome you to today's virtual event where we have got the amazing Shane Snow, an author of a really important book that has just come out not that long ago. Last week, Dream Teams, working together and apart. Shane has an incredible background as a journalist and storyteller and best-selling author for Smart Cuts. But you turned your energy to this book, Dream Teams, and we are super excited to be able to share it and talk about it with our community. Later in this discussion, we're going to give some time for Q&A, so please get ready to ask questions. We'll be able to share your with Shane and get his answers live to you, so please keep those in mind, and we'll give more information about those questions with us. So, Shane, let's just get at it. First of all, I love the book. It's great.
Thank you.
It's
Thank
really helpful book. And as we were talking about it, a lot of stuff I was like, yeah, I try to do that. And then other stuff I was like, oh, I should try to do that. This is hard. Building good dream teams or bringing a dream team, there's a lot to it. What got you interested in doing this book or writing this topic?
In part, I had started a company 8 years ago, and a couple years in, I realized that my job, I'm a journalist, right? Yeah. My job is to find stories and to tell them and to be creative. And I was sort of the creative marketing person at this startup. Yeah. And at first, I was doing all of that, and then a couple years in, I realized that I was not doing any of that. I was actually finding people to do that, do other things, and I had some anxiety around what is the kind of leader that can unlock the best out of their people. And I really wanted my team to be smarter than me because we're going to fail if we're only going to be as smart as me. And at the same time, it's, when you write a book, and especially this kind of, pop science business kind of book, there's a lot of sort of a confluence of things that sort of come together and then you realize this is a book, not an article. And so I was just sort of noticing also as I was growing up more, as I'm getting more mature, that I'm part of a lot of teams that I don't really think of, right? As I've got more involved in my neighborhood and community and got just more interested in sort of what's going on in the world, realized that the same things that I was having anxiety about in my company are also sort of the source of all the problems we have kind of in the world, which is basically when different people come together, we can make magic, or usually we slow each other down, we fight, we destroy things, we invent great inventions, and we turn them on each other. Yeah. So I wanted to get at the psychology of human collaboration, the new things that I had been learning in neuroscience around what happens when different people interact, and see how we can kind of apply that to getting better, not just in our companies, our teams, but as citizens. And there's even applications for, as you read, for family and that sort of thing. Yeah. So it became sort of this over the course of several years, and then kind of went down a rabbit hole of science and history, but also data. Yeah. And which is why I'm a huge fan of Tableau, which is how I ended up here, is because I use Tableau a bunch. So this is the nutshell story. Yeah, cool. Of the book.
And so in general, I mean, the title is pretty evocative of the content, but how are you describing what it's about and how people can use it and how people can learn from it?
So it's about incredible and how we can become more like that in our different collaborations. It's about which is that most of the time 2 heads are not better than 1.
Yeah, which is not what people think. That's the cliche, right? 2 heads are better than 1.
Yeah, most of the time they're not. Yeah. Most of the time heads are only as good as the smartest head. Yeah. And yet sometimes, and you've felt, I'm sure, at various times, you're part of a group that feels infinite. Yeah. Like you can do the impossible, and sometimes do win, right? And the ragtag army beats the army with the overwhelming forces. And so the book is about doing that rather than slowing down. And, we have to work together. Anything big, anything important requires people. Yes. And so do we endure the slowdown that happens when lots of people have to coordinate, or the friction that fighting, or do we harness the potential that's there and become something more. And I think that's the pitch of what the book is about. How do we break through instead of breaking down in our group work together?
Yeah, which is a great it's just a great way to, because so many times you have a work group that's not a team. You know, and like you just pointed out, which you're right. There's so many instances in life when you are on a team, but you wouldn't call it that.
Right.
You know, so it is these dynamics apply in so many places, not just the office and not just work, but also how can you improve work life because of these things. So you have several aspects to what makes a dream team. You know, there's the you know the whole idea that you should hire people like you. Culture is not actually a belief or an indicator of a great team. You actually want a little bit of diversity. You know, the other things in your book that you talk about. What are some of the most important factors that you found that surprised you? Like, wow, this is an element of a great team. This is amazing, or this is really powerful.
There were a lot of things.
A lot of things, right.
A lot of, the ones that you mentioned. If there was an equation for what's the math of a team that breaks through instead of breaking down, you start with cognitive diversity, which is that you have people who have different perspectives and heuristics and strategies, and all of that is based on your story and who you are and all the things that we think about with demographic diversity. And you want them to actually bring those different ways of thinking, which is going to cause so what we often do since the 70s, when we did the research that showed that you're happiest at work when you work with people just like you and with your same personality, we've equated that incorrectly with being productive and being solving problems. Turns out you're not as good at solving problems if everyone is like you. But if everyone's not like each other, then you're going to have different kinds of problems, right? You're going to have conflict and difference of opinions and awkward communication, and so you need to build some sort of trust around that. But what you want, the thing that surprised me the most is that it's the conflict itself, the ideological, intellectual conflict that helps us to become smarter than any one member of our. There's actual mathematical proofs that they've done to sort of prove this out, which is really cool. So that conflict, harnessing that friction is the game. But the other thing, I think the most surprising thing, was actually where the book sort of ends on, which is it's great if you have a big group of people bringing lots of different things, and you're respecting that and appreciating that. And it's great if you can have those battle, and you can kind of keep the relationship in this zone of, sort of the nuclear reactor things. But that does you no good if it boils over and gets personal, right? Which is what often happens, and that leads us to hold back or to kill each other. Look at Congress, right? Like,
oh my gosh, yeah.
And it also does no good if no one's willing to change, willing to their viewpoint, let go of their ego, and separate your ego from your intellect. You need to be right. So the last couple chapters of the book, I explored this new thing, and it's a brand new thing that we can now do in psychology called intellectual humility. This is one of the things I use Tableau for. So for years, we philosophers and psychologists have argued about open-mindedness. What does it mean, and how do you get more of it? How do you become more closed-minded? And we have theories, but we couldn't ever measure. The closest thing we can measure is openness to experience, which is part of the Big 5 personality test. So, are you willing to try pickle-flavored ice cream, basically? And that's different. That's you could say you're open-minded if you're willing to do that, but if you're willing to change your mind once you try something, then you're not really open-minded.
I see.
And if you're willing to try the ice cream, but you don't respect people who don't like it or whatever, then you're not really open-minded either. We couldn't really measure that until 2017, when an assessment came out that was published in the Journal of Personality or something like that, some academic journal, to actually measure this thing called intellectual humility, which is the other part of that open-mindedness equation. Do you respect other viewpoints? Do you separate your ego from your intellect? Can you not be so overconfident intellectually, and can you revise your viewpoint? So originally I used Tableau. Actually, I wanted to dig into correlations between openness to experience and different sort of demographic factors or ways you've lived your life. So I downloaded this huge database of personality tests that's been out there forever, millions of people taking this test, to try and sort of map out patterns of if you've lived in a lot of different places that make you more open to trying new food, that kind of thing. And there were some correlations there that I found using Tableau.
But it's interesting in the book, for sure.
But when I found this intellectual humility thing, that is brand new that very little research has been done other than now we can measure it.
Yeah.
I combined those two tests, and I did this huge study, national study of basically asked people all those questions in these academic assessments, and then a bunch of things that I had hypotheses about that maybe can make you more or less intellectually humble, more open-minded. Stuff like, what do you read? How much do you read? What do you watch on television? What kinds of things? How much do you watch? Where you've lived? What languages you speak? Where you've been educated? Whether you have the same religion as your parents? All sorts of things that I had theorized that maybe if you do these things, that'll correlate with more open-mindedness. And that was where I was like, I am not a data scientist. So I done this huge, wonderful study, and now I have to figure out, along these different dimensions of open-mindedness, are there correlations? Can we determine causation? And so I was really surprised. Back to your original question. My biggest surprise was, so I'm a journalist, right? So I write news and then I try and unpack things. Turned out that watching lots of news, reading lots of news does not make you more open-minded. Makes you more informed.
Yes, okay.
But you're not going to be more open-minded. Even if you watch both Fox and MSNBC for hours a day, it's not going to make you more open-minded. But reading fiction will. And watching fictional shows on Netflix will. And the conclusion that I came to, and there's more research to be done, but it's that there's a lot of science to storytelling, how stories are a way for human beings to relate to each other, to build empathy with each other, and the more stories you take in of people who are not like you, the more your brain trains itself to be okay with there being two right ways to do something, which then can kind of parlay into, we're working together, we have an argument, we disagree on something, or we're trying to explore new territory. I can maybe let my inner ego have to be right about my way of seeing things, which then will help us to make more progress. So reading more books, it's good. Learning stories, and I suspect that nonfiction stories also help.
Probably
stories of
do,
people that are not like you.
Yeah.
But I was really surprised. At first I was bummed, and I was like, we should watch more news, but actually we should learn more stories.
Yeah, no, I when I read that in your book, I was like, wow, that's amazing. But it makes sense. And I look at my children that are growing, and my son is young, and he doesn't read. I read him stories, but he watches shows on TV, and my daughter, same thing. And I have always been like guilty about that. But I've been maybe during the course of your book realizing that sometimes their ability to watch good stories on TV does help them be more empathetic and more sympathetic. My daughter in particular is super empathetic and a super justice person. She wants the world to be fair, and I think she's not a huge reader, but I think that these stories, either we tell her or things she's watched or whatever, helps her relate to other points of view, other opinions, because you can. When I read a book, I feel like I'm that main character. You know what I mean? So it does build your empathy.
That's the brain science at work.
Yeah. So it's fascinating, and data storytelling is something that I think a lot of our customers and our folks in our community are really interested in. How do you use data and facts to tell stories that move people?
Yes.
And your book is a great example of that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
well, there's a lot of really great brain science that shows that if you put up a chart, then maybe that you generated through Tableau on the screen, a visualization, and you just have it there, that a couple areas of your brain will light up, and you'll process it, and it's fine. But if you tell a story about that same information, you actually use the data and the chart to unearth a story that 5 times as much of your brain will light up when you're hearing this story, because you fill in, especially if it's about a real person, or a real, something that you can relate to. Your imagination fills in all of these gaps, and then you remember it more.
Yeah, and then you've built...
Is what we want,
Yes,
right?
totally. And then that building of intellectual humility across your teams and your organization will foster this much stronger teams, that really build and have all these great ideas and are open to great ideas.
Yeah.
So, some other things I thought were in your book were about the Angelic Troublemaker. Talk a little bit about that one too. Yeah.
So that chapter is about one of my favorite people in history, a woman named Nellie Bly. Actually, her name was Elizabeth Jane Cochran. Nellie Bly was her pen name. She was the first great investigative journalist. She's the reason that we have the Pulitzer Prizes, because Joseph Pulitzer was known as this pioneering, groundbreaking newspaper man. But he was running this rubbish newspaper, this gossip rag, until Nellie Bly showed up and changed everything.
Yeah.
So I think the statue at Columbia University Journalism School should actually be of her, not of Pulitzer. But I digress. So her story was basically that she walked into the newspaper one day and said, I want to be a reporter. I want to be a detective journalist. And they said, well, that's, not a thing. And, you can type, the reports, but, we're going to have other reporters, the men will do the work. And she said, no, I want to do this. And so to his credit, he said, okay. And she would do these crazy investigations where my favorite one, the one that I talk about in the book, that she's most famous for, she got herself locked up in the insane asylum so she could get a look at the inside of the asylum and how the inmates were treated. And then they busted out after 10 days and this huge expose on basically what was being hidden from the public. And it, everything blew up and the government was like, we need to change this and change the whole mental health system in America. She would do stories like that. And so the chapter is about angelic troublemakers because I get into basically the research on how when you have a team and you have had success with something, you kind of end up on this plateau, what's called cognitive entrenchment. Your past success leads you to be kind of blind to other ways of doing something. And then you kind of sort of ignore sort of the surroundings. And so, so they built this mental health system in the asylums. They got rid of the people who were bothering people on the street and some people who they shouldn't have gotten rid of. And then they forgot about it. And everything was fine until someone provoked them into seeing what they needed to see. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that I talk about how when you have a brainstorming session, if you have one person who's coming in with really wacky ideas, it helps everyone to think differently.
I love that point, because it wasn't just like come and brainstorm reasonable ideas. It was, your point in the book was, you can come in and brainstorm crazy stuff, and it actually raises the creativity and even the people who would poach only reasonable ideas, they're higher level reasonable ideas. So even wacky stuff makes everyone else raises their game, even if no one else does wacky. So I just it's such great insights. The provocation was
there's also you have a group of people brainstorming and someone who's different in like a visible way, or they did these studies with a group of frat boys are supposed to solve a murder mystery, and then someone from the other frat joins. Suddenly everyone thinks more, has like a higher level of sort of cognition in their problem solving. Same thing with, you have a group that's redecorating an office, and they're planning the redecoration, and someone rolls in on a wheelchair. Everyone's going to think differently about that project. It starts to give you an excuse for, not just because, weird or wacky ideas are helpful, but actually a pragmatic excuse for including other people that are not like you in your process. So I loved all that. And the point of the Angelic Troublemakers, that quote comes from Bayard Rustin, who's a key figure in the civil rights movement. He said that in every community we need angelic troublemakers to help push us forward. So making it safe to blow the whistle, which is what the government did with the press, right? They said, you're not going to be arrested for exposing something that's wrong. And I think building that into our teams, making it explicitly safe to do that, is how we can move forward.
No, it's such.
Anyway,
so
I'm
many
totally
good,
ramble on that part. I get excited.
So many good insights. In fact, what's so amazing too about the book, and I think people, not only do you learn so much from like, oh, this is how we can team better, but your stories. How did you unearth these incredible because they to your point, you tell us something about a dream team or a team aspect, and the way you illustrate it with a historical story or a real life story just really cements it in. How did you find all these great stories? How did you find them all? There's some really amazing ones. I mean, of course the Russian team is great, but there was a couple that I was like, wow.
We were talking about the Wu-Tang Clan,
the
Daimler
Wu-Tang
Chrysler
Clan.
earlier.
Yeah, the Wu-Tang Clan, or Daimler Chrysler. Oh my gosh. Could you ever read a book or an article where you're juxtapositioning the Daimler Chrysler merger with Wu-Tang Clan? I mean, that's incredible, but it completely works.
I had a lot of fun with it. So that's half the answer, is I wanted to have fun. I want to write a book that I wanted to read.
That's great,
But so I have two kinds of stories that I really like. Stories that you don't know about people that you do know. So what's the hidden behind the scenes story about, Abraham Lincoln's trip to his inauguration, right?
Oh, that was a great story too. And it was the woman detective, I think, in that one. Oh my God! I'm now remembering the woman FBI officer who got the John Gotti or somebody mafia boss got the subpoena served.
So she's an example of the other kind of story, which is people who you don't know that you should know about. And so how I find them, usually it's like lots and lots of reading and looking for. I read lots of history books, so I have like in the chapter about
Yeah.
the police,
Yeah.
right? I started reading all of these history books about private detectives
Oh,
and,
okay, yeah.
you know, Alan Pinkerton, who's this famous, you know, guy
yeah,
in
yeah.
private detective work. And then I learned about the side characters and realized that, you know, there's not much written about these side characters, so then dig into their biographies. So it's sort of this rabbit hole of, you know, the stack of books that I read just to find the kinds of
Yeah,
stories that I wanted. And then, you know, people who are in the private detective industry, they know who Kate Warren is, they know who Pinkerton is, but people who read business books likely don't.
Yeah,
So
right.
can I take that story and weave it into kind of the research that I have? And so that's kind of the
Yeah,
process.
well, great finding those stories that showcase and really what this book is all about and what teams are really about, what
Yeah.
you're really describing there. What, you know, if you were to just, you know, recommend, what would you say some recommendations for like how to take some of the key points, or just even today, how could you walk away and be thinking, how can I build better teams, or, you know, drive a better culture for teams?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of, so in the back of the book I have an actual cheat sheet for strategies, a bunch of stuff on my website, it's just my name. But in terms of, I think every individual, right, teams are made of people, right? And we're all part of lots of teams, whether we like it or not. And I think start to think of, and start to notice the context in which there is teamwork afoot, or teamwork could be afoot, and start to think more of your role, I guess, as a citizen and in anything as a team. I think also think of your intellectual opponents as part of your team too. If this cognitive friction thing is what actually leads us to come up with better ideas, then we need to invite the detractors, the dissenters. Next time you're working on a project, you need someone to review it to see how it's done, instead of inviting your best friend or your favorite collaborator to do that. Find someone who is a legitimate critic of yours. So I started doing that. I actually did this with this book. You know, the guy who tore me apart one time in the Atlantic. I hit him up for,
did you?
You're gonna hate some of this, so tell me what you think. And when you invite it, it stings less when they give you the critical feedback. But if you start to think of, hey, even my detractors, even my critics are part of my team.
Yeah.
You invite them into it, and then really the goal becomes about getting better, not about protecting your fragile ego. So that's sort of you know, the initial tip. I would say also everyone in the world should take the intellectual humility test.
Yeah.
So if you go to shanesnow.com/IH.
IH/IH on your website, shanesnow.com.
You can take the real test. It'll email you your results and then some tips on how to get better. So when I took it, I wrote about this, right? And I'm a curious person, and I was like, I'm gonna nail this test. I'm gonna be 100%. I did poorly on a couple. I did well at respecting other viewpoints. Did well at changing my mind, but I did very poorly on intellectual overconfidence.
Oh.
And in particular, I did below average. So I did like average in intellectual overconfidence and below average in separating my ego from my intellect.
Oh.
And so now I have marching orders.
Yeah.
How
It's hard too, I'm sure.
Right? So if I change my mind, it hurts real bad, right?
Oh.
And then I'm depressed or whatever, and that actually makes me a bad collaborator in some ways. So everyone should take that test and learn
Good
what areas they
advice.
can work on.
Yeah, so you do something for yourself to learn how you could help be a better future team member.
Exactly, a better contributor. The other thing I'd say is one of the bits of research from that IH study that I used Tableau for is if you travel a lot, obviously that's one that's sort of intuitive. You rank score better on that.
That was really
But if you live in another country, the threshold is about 2 or 3 months.
Yeah.
Then there's a significant change in all of those factors.
Yeah.
So this year I actually went and lived in Mexico City for a few months. I was like, I want to get better at this stuff and have a little less ego with my right way of saying or doing things, and even just living in another culture where you have to actually start to live like they do is extremely helpful. So if you have the means to do it, not everyone's privileged enough to be able to do that, but if you have the means, take a sabbatical and go somewhere that's unlike anywhere you've lived before.
And just even when I read that in the book, I also thought to myself, try to stretch yourself even when you just travel, and don't take the typical vacation, or don't take the pre-digested tour that shields you from all the things that are really interesting about that place.
Stay in an Airbnb instead of a hotel and meet the person who lives there. Go to dinner with them.
Totally cool. So one last question before we move to, and we'll have to make this quick. Just outside of your book, though, as we talked about, you are a journalist, and you recently, and this is really interesting, I think, to a lot of folks. You had a story published in the Guardian about the pay gap between men and women, and you had a lot of findings in that. And can you share some of what you discovered and some of the data findings?
We made
just before we start taking questions.
Yeah,
in
we made
2 minutes,
some
yeah.
awesome visit with Tableau for that story.
Cool, yeah.
So basically, it was a year-long study where we wanted to, so the gender pay gap, right?
Mm-hmm.
Men and women getting paid differently for the same jobs. Uh, we wanted to look at the government. So the private sector, there's lots of data on that. How's the government doing? Because in JFK was the one who started the commission for equal government pay for men and women. And we wanted to know, okay, 50, 60 years later, how are we doing? Is the government doing better in that aspect than the private sector? And so we sent freedom of information requests to every department of government, every state, every federal agency, and the top 50 cities. And we had all this data on their payrolls, so job title, salary, age, gender, and ethnicity. So there's more work to be done with this huge data set. We had to marry all the data, it was a huge pain. And then we used Tableau and we actually worked with some folks, donated their time from Tableau to help us make these vises. And we found something really interesting that, one, in general, the government has a smaller pay gap. It's still not perfect. It was a smaller pay gap than the private sector. But state by state, there's some really interesting anomalies. And California was actually the biggest surprise. You'd think it's a very liberal state, so they probably would be having more conversations about that. But it actually had a really enormous pay gap when you average it out, only because of a couple of departments. And what they found is that, so like the state troopers, for example, most of them are men and they get paid a lot. The female state troopers get paid the same because it's the government, because that's the rule. But it turns out that we actually place different values on certain jobs that are needed for society. And we just say that, hey, a high school teacher at a state school, we value that less than a state trooper. And most of these are women and most of these are men. And so actually the pay gap is something in California we spent some time with. They said, we struggle with this because it's actually the set salaries we have for some of these jobs that are skewing more one way or another, that we need to recruit better and all this. So it opened up a different discussion on the pay gap of, hey, as a society, can we agree to value some of these jobs a little differently? We should value teachers more, and how do we also get more women into law enforcement and all that? Which that actually led to that chapter in Dream Teams. But it was so the Guardian published a smaller version, and then we published on Medium the bigger version with all the vises. But Tableau was a key part of that.
Cool. Well, I love your brand of data-driven journalism and data-driven storytelling, so thank you for that. I think we do have some questions. Here's some questions from YouTube and from Facebook. What is the number one thing, I talked about this, but specifically, number one thing companies and managers can do to make their teams more collaborative? Like, I'm heading a team right now. What can I do differently? Or what can my organization do differently?
So leadership for ages, since we were living around campfires, we thought of leaders as the big one. And usually the big guy, right?
The big guy,
the big one who is going to lead us to battle, and they can take the bows and arrows and the bullets and whatever, and they're brave and they're strong and unflinching. And there's a lot of evidence that that's still how we make a lot of our leadership decisions. CEOs tend to be taller than not CEOs, and we did this whole data study actually on CEOs and presidents and heights and heightism and how much you make based on height. There's some of these things that are just built into our brains that, that looks like a leader. So you're more likely to just have an easier path to leadership. Whereas the best leaders, the leaders of groundbreaking teams, we looked at sports dynasties, sports teams that win for years and years and years. And you find that the team captain of the sports dynasty is usually not the best player, not the front-running player. It's the person who is the most giving and humble and generous, the person who's willing to sacrifice their body for the other person on the team to get the goal or whatever it is. And they lead from the shadows, or if they need to, but they lead with humility. And I think the thing that we need to change, the number one thing we need to change in terms of leadership, and I think any team player should do this too, is stop thinking of the leader as having to be the smartest one, the strongest one, the one that is the hero. Actually, the leader's job is to recognize that the team combined needs to be smarter and better than that hero. So your job is to empower the team with information, give them the ability to make decisions and to support them in that, and kind of stay in this zone of complete personal and emotional support, that you're not going to be punished for who you are and all that, and complete kind of intellectual pushback, that always pushing people to do more, to think differently, being able to sort of rile up that provocation, that friction, while having people know that you trust them, that they're not going to be punished, and building that into the way that we promote. So not just promoting people for making the big visible deals, but promote people for enabling the team.
Yeah.
I think that's and easier said than done, but that's the mindset shift that we need to flip.
That's super great. Let me ask you. You were also you've been using Tableau because you were the founder of Contently and always doing data, so which is fascinating. Do you find a lot of your stories or all the work data is just become indispensable, or how does data figure into all the other things you're doing as well? There's sort of do you guys use Tableau? How do you use it? Yeah.
Our VP of marketing, when he found out I was coming here, he was so jealous because he's a power user. He has this he named it Garfield. I don't know why, but he has this Tableau dashboard that is like the mega dashboard of like if he could have 10 screens with it on it, he would. But he uses Tableau to make all of the marketing decisions in our company.
Cool. Wow. Cool.
And he's been doing it for years. And he showed me some screenshots. I should have shared them with you. So yeah, Tableau is a big part of how we make decisions there. And for my brand of journalism, I think as a journalist, my job is to seek the truth and minimize harm and tell stories that help people to change their minds. And introducing something new to the world that way, data is a really good way to do that. And there's a lot of stories that are out there, but they're hidden underneath mountains of data. And so finding the stories in the data so you can then get at the truth, the real story, not just the anecdote, and then you share the story around that true story to help change people's minds and lives. That's to me, that's really important.
Yeah, so. That's great. And there's a certain solidness to it, for sure.
You feel you feel confident.
Yeah,
right?
Sometimes you read stories and you're like, well, that seems like an anecdote, not necessarily a representative. And I think data grounds you in stories that are representative and true consistently or across the world. So here's a good question. What book besides your own are you reading right now? And you mentioned you've read, you're a huge reader, obviously.
I'm a big reader.
What books are you reading?
So I just finished. A friend of mine just wrote a book. It comes out this week, maybe it just came out. His name's Alan Gannett. He's the founder of another data startup called TrackMaven. They do competitive analytics. His book is called The Creative Curve, and it's basically a scientific look at creativity. We tend to categorize people as like, oh, that's a creative person, or I'm not creative. Yeah. It's basically looking at the science of how we can all be more creative. Yeah. And there's a lot of books on creativity out there. The Pixar guy wrote that great book. Yeah. But this is the most fascinating nonfiction book in a while because it's actually getting at how if you don't think that you're creative, there's things that you can actually do. Yeah, you know what? That's such a great thing because creativity is not binary. It's not you are or you aren't. Yeah, it's a scale. It's different with certain environments. You're going to be much more creative. And there's things you can do to be more creative, and you use data to find that. So kind of on theme. Yeah. Cool. Like that book a lot. All right, I think I've got time to take one more question, and I'm seeing one here that says. Let's see. Well, I don't want to be too self-serving. Somebody is asking about your favorite feature in Tableau. Do you have one real quick? Because then I'll do another question. I mean, I like the drag and drop nature. The button where you can flip the chart. So I'm not very sophisticated. No, I get help when I need to do it, but I like that it's so simple. That's good. What was your favorite part about writing the book? Is there any favorite part of writing a book? Writing books There's least favorite parts for sure. I know it's hard. I love the stories. I love finding the stories. I love the aha moments. For me, my writing process is I spend years doing the research and finding, taking notes and finding everything that I want to say. And then I go hole up somewhere for a couple months and I just write for 10, 15 hours a day. Wow. And, coffee is my friend. And I love that part where you just feel like you're just flowing. You've done all the collaboration that you need. You've gotten all the inputs, all the research. You memorize your notes, and it's just words coming out of your fingers. Flow. Yeah, it's not everyone's writing process, but for me, that's it's like the past and the future melt away, and you're just there, and I love it. I think for a lot of our community and our people, they have that same feeling when they're working with data. Yeah. That they're in this flow of like it's combined, it's brought together maybe by Tableau Prep. A little commercial for our new product, you guys out there. It's free for a lot of you. Please do use it. But you're in this flow of like your space, your headspace that you're just like, this is who I am. I am expressing myself the way I'm intended to. I think as human beings, awesome. We're often chasing that feeling of where you don't care about anything except right now. Yeah, and it's your best self too. It's your best self. Like when I'm analyzing data and I'm feeling like, wow, the flow. I feel like I'm at my best. You're discovering things. Yeah, discovering this. The flow. Yeah. So, well, Shane, I think we are at the end. Thank you so much for being here. This was a fascinating conversation. People, I've read this book, both in paper, I have this, and I have it in Kindle. It's really great. I highly recommend it. Check it out, Dream Teams, working together with
apart. Great advice in here, some great use of Tableau. A couple of data sets we should all be looking at. shanesnow.com/IH. Take that test.
Please.
And look for some fun data sets about teamwork. So thank you guys for joining us, and see you soon on the flip side there. Thank you.